I will go ahead and launch right into tonight's program. We have several hundred years of history to cover in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to try to make this, try to get through this quickly as possible so that you actually have a chance to get upstairs and see the show before we leave tonight. This show began as part of an initiative that we've been working on over the last couple of years here at the Telfair to get more of our permanent collection out into the galleries. We have a lot of great stuff that doesn't always see the light of day, and so it's really nice to pull together works from the collection, maybe in new combinations that we haven't done before, and that's really sort of how this show came about. We were looking at options for permanent collection exhibitions, and we noticed, hey, we have a lot of images in the collection that reflect the Savannah riverfront. Why is that? Well, we have a lot of artists who have worked over the past several centuries on the Savannah waterfront, and our collection is strongest probably in 20th century, early to mid 20th century works in that regard. And that's where it began, and it sort of grew into a monster from there, and we borrowed a few works to help flesh out the story as best we can, especially historic works, the older works that we did not have in our permanent collection, and so you'll see the show include some of these earlier pieces. Please don't be disappointed if you don't see your favorite Savannah artist turn up in the exhibition or even in my talk tonight. There have been so many artists who have worked on the Savannah waterfront over the years, and especially when you get into the last couple of decades, that number has just expanded exponentially. So again, please forgive me if you don't see your favorite artist tonight. I'll try to name check as many of them as I can, though, and we're going to get right into things. You'll see this image again in just a minute, so I'm going to skip past that one for now. And I guess the big question is, where do we begin looking at art representing the Savannah waterfront? It's a difficult question. Do we start with the founding of Savannah, or do we go back further? For me, I'm always fascinated that, we think about Savannah, we think about its history, and of course it's been around for about 281 years, but very often we don't realize that there was a community just west of us that was active for about 500 years and had really, and had seen its heyday before the Europeans even arrived. And I'm talking about the site that you see on screen here in two images from the Georgia Historical Society. One of those images is in the exhibition upstairs. These were taken around 1939 by the Foltz Photography Studio, which was one of Savannah's longest running photography outfits from about 1900 to the 1960s, started by George Foltz. And what you're looking at here is a documentation of an archaeological dig that took place between 1937 and 1939, right on the Savannah riverbank, just west of where we're sitting tonight. And this is the site of the Irene Mounds, a Mississippian, mid to late Mississippian site, which was inhabited by native people from around 1100 to 1600 AD. And this site was known for years. People knew about it, referred to it as the Hill or so on. And by the early 20th century, there had been this interest in going out there and exploring it further. Some local Savannians, Mr. and Mrs. Marmaduke Floyd, were local boosters of the project. And with funding from the WPA, archaeologists came in and began excavating the site. And what you're looking at here on the left is a temple mound, the Temple Mound, which was the largest structure. It was about 16 feet or more in height, that was sat right on the Savannah River. And this is right at the intersection of the Savannah River and Pipe Makers Creek, or Pipe Makers Canal. This is a site that's now part of the Georgia Ports Authority. The mound itself does not any longer exist because it was excavated almost to the ground by archaeologists working on the project. And all sorts of interesting things were found in addition to the Temple Mound. There was a smaller burial mound. There was a rotunda-like structure, which you see on the right. Just fascinating to see that there were people creating this kind of architecture in Savannah so long ago. Another really amazing image, this is also from the Georgia Historical Society, from the Coastal Georgia Archaeology Collection, shows the excavation of this mound. And you can see how close the site is to the river. You can see the river in the background there. And it's one of a series of photographs probably taken by Marmaduke Floyd, who was a local supporter of the excavation. And, but what I think is really amazing about this image, just look at the expression of the woman in the foreground. There's this very pensive expression on her face. This woman was one of a crew of African-American women who were hired basically to do the archaeological dig, working with professional archaeologists who were leading the project. And many of these women were interviewed later on. Some of them had very interesting things to say about it. I mean, some of them, human remains were dug up at the time. And one woman said that, she felt sorry for the people that she was excavating, digging them up like that. Whatever one may think of that part of the project, this was the most thoroughly excavated American Indian site in Georgia at the time. And again, unfortunately, the site no longer exists, but if you go to the Live Oak Libraries, you can actually see materials, see a report that came out of that project. And of course, these images are also out there online. So we've kind of started a bit with the early history before the city of Savannah is even founded. But of course, the city of Savannah was founded in February of 1733. Oglethorpe and company arrived at the bluff of Savannah, and made arrangements with the local population, a group of Native Americans led by Tomochichi, the Miko, or leader of this group of Creek Indians who were here at the site. They actually agreed to move downriver, to move their town of Yamacraw downriver, or upriver, I should say, to the site of the Irene Mound eventually. So Tomochichi was sort of taking on this sort of, kind of looking back to this sort of Mississippian heritage in doing that, but he was also trying to accommodate Oglethorpe and put himself in a good position for trading and so on. And here we have a view of Savannah just a year after its founding, probably one of the most iconic images of Savannah that shows the town growing from the waterfront. And there's a lot of mystery behind this image. It's often called the Peter Gordon image of Savannah. But surprisingly, we don't know who actually drew this image. Peter Gordon's name appears prominently on the print. This print was actually engraved in London in 1734 and presented by Peter Gordon to Georgia's trustees to show the progress of the colony. And it's a somewhat romanticized view. It's embellished a bit from what one would really have encountered looking at Savannah just a year after its founding. More buildings were shown built in the image, I think, than actually existed at the time. It was engraved by a man named Paul Foudrinier in London, but it was engraved from an original drawing by someone. Peter Gordon brought this drawing with him. There's the thought that it may have been created by Noble Jones, who was the surveyor of the colony. Interestingly, Noble Jones, at the time, the date that you see on this print, March 1734, at that time he was up exploring the site of Ebenezer with Baron von Reck. So I'm not sure if Jones was even here on that date or if that date was added to this later on, but the mystery remains who the original artist was. Von Reck, by the way, was one of the only well-trained artist present in the early Georgia colony. And we just learned we're going to be showing his sketchbooks next year. Really amazing views of the early days of Georgia. So stay tuned for that. Moving a little further along, we don't see a lot of great images of Savannah in the late 18th century and early 19th century. But I'm showing you this just for fun. It's one that I hope to include in the exhibition, and for reasons of space, we had to leave it out. It's a view of the port of Savannah from the 1780s by Claude-Joseph Vernet, a very famous French marine painter. He was really noted for these views of European ports. And what's funny about this is that this is not Savannah at all. This is a totally fictitious view of, of the port of Savannah, a Savannah that didn't exist. We didn't have brick fortifications like that on the river at that time. This is totally fictitious. Actually, what's probably more the case is if you think about when this was done in the 1780s, you think about the Revolutionary War era and a French interest in American affairs at the time. What likely is the case is that this is a view of a European port, which was kind of Vernet's stock imagery, and his publisher may have labeled this and other prints in this same series with the names of American ports to sort of cash in on French interest in American affairs. So anyway, it's an interesting story, but it's not Savannah. It is labeled Savannah, so you will see this image out there, and sorry that one is not in the show. As I said, when you move into the late 18th century and early 19th century, you really do not see very many images of Savannah or the river. A lot of the images that we have from Savannah at that time are portraits. You have portraits that were commissioned by local folks of means, everything from very folksy, self-taught portraits to more accomplished pieces. So we really we miss out on a lot of the history that was happening, at least when you look at the art record, you're really not seeing a lot of the history that was going on. Again, like Oglethorpe's departure from Georgia and the introduction of slavery, the growth of trade, the growth of the initial growth of the port of Savannah. And also military events that took place on the Savannah River from the Revolutionary War going forward. I'm kind of skipping ahead to the War of 1812 here, and we don't have an image that was done during that day, but what I'm showing you is an image of Fort Jackson, which of course was completed at the time of the War of 1812. And this was actually painted in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, by Christopher A.D. Murphy, who, more than any other Savannah artist, really dedicated himself to documenting the architectural landscape of the city and its environs. And in the 1920s, Christopher A.D. Murphy, or Chris Murphy Jr., would go out in a boat and explore these ruined forts on the Savannah River. Our two great forts that still survive today, Fort Jackson, seen here, and Fort Pulaski. And there was something about the romance, I think, of these sites that attracted Murphy, and there are numerous sketches that Chris Murphy Jr. Made of both forts that still survived. This is a beautiful little painting showing Fort Jackson still in a ruined, overgrown state in the 1920s. And it's hard to think about it now, but Fort Jackson, which of course saw its most intensive usage through the period of the Civil War, fell into disrepair, of course, and by the 1920s, it was a ruin here. Fort Pulaski had already been named a National Historic Landmark, though, by the mid-1920s, and then the Civilian Conservation Corps came in and started to clean it up, and it was eventually open to the public. Fort Jackson languished for a much longer period of time. It was sold to the city as parkland and was threatened with demolition as late as 1958. And of course, later it was saved and opened to the public by the by the Coastal Heritage Society, and is one of our great historic sites today. Other sites that were important on the Savannah River during the antebellum era were not really captured in art at the time. We see art that depicted these sites later on in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. One of the most famous sites along the Savannah River that drew a lot of artists and of course figured prominently in Savannah's history was the Hermitage Plantation. And of course you had the whole string of Savannah River plantations that were part of the economic engine of Georgia at that time. You had the growth of plantation slavery following Oglethorpe's departure. You have the invention of the cotton gin taking place on Mulberry Grove Plantation in 1793. So a lot of stuff happened at the Savannah River plantations, of course all fueled by the labors of the enslaved. One of the most famous of the Savannah River plantations was the Hermitage, built by Henry McAlpin, and it was an industrial plantation. So in addition to agriculture, they were actively producing building materials, chiefly the bricks that we think of that built Savannah. as well as ironwork and so on. The Hermitage is shown here in some turn-of-the-century photographs taken by photographers working for the Detroit Publishing Company. And the Hermitage attracted a lot of artists into the 1920s and 30s. Here you see the derelict main house on the left, and on the right you see the Avenue of Oaks. And on the left side of that image, you'll see the slave quarters lined up along the Avenue of Oaks. This is an image taken in the, actually, I'm sorry, the date is wrong on that. It should be 1930s. This photograph was taken by the famous photographer Walker Evans, who was just one of many artists who were drawn to the Hermitage, which was, again, just west of the city of Savannah. And here's the row of slave cabins again lining the Avenue of Oaks. The Hermitage was widely known. It was featured in postcards and views of Savannah, unfortunately, it did not survive. A fellow named Henry Ford took a shine to it and decided that he would dismantle the main house of the Hermitage plantation and use the materials to build his house in Richmond Hill. And then the slave quarters were also demolished. Two of them, though, were saved and sent to Henry Ford's museum in Michigan, where they still stand today. Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, wrote to Savannah's mayor in 1935 trying to intercede to preserve the Hermitage site, but to no avail. That site, along with the sites of most of the other Savannah River plantations, eventually were converted to larger scale industry, and those sites remain part of our industrial landscape today. We do see a dramatic uptick in art produced in Savannah and showing sites along the Savannah River at the time of the Civil War. And one reason for this is that artists were employed, and artists were actually sent here to record significant events and doings during the war years. They range from sketch artists to engravers to photographers, all who were sort of descending on Savannah at various times to send word back to major publications. And one has to keep in mind that at the time of the Civil War, of course, you didn't have the halftone photography process in use for illustrating newspaper stories. And so what would happen is that the newspapers would hire a sketch artist, and you'll see in a lot of these old newspaper illustrations a drawing by our special artist so-and-so. And then these sketches were sent by courier up to the newspaper. It might be Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. This is an image on the left from Frank Leslie's Illustrated News by W.T. Crane, who sketched a number of images in Savannah during the Civil War, an image of Fort Pulaski. Often these sketches would then be taken and turned into wood engravings by engravers working back at the newspaper's office, and then reproduced in print. We also had photographers visiting Savannah during the war years. On the right, an image from the Library of Congress's collection by Timothy H. O'Sullivan showing the dismounted mortar following the bombardment of Fort Pulaski in 1862. And Fort Pulaski figures prominently. You see a lot of art, and I'm not going to show it all to you tonight. Courier and Ives is a print about the bombardment of Fort Pulaski. There are a lot of great images out there, and I encourage you to look those up. As I mentioned, these images of Savannah appeared in numerous periodicals. Here we see a wood engraving from the Illustrated London News. We actually have a German version of the same paper in our collection here at the Telfair with the same image, which shows the building of fortifications just east of Savannah on Bruton Hill. And you can see the Savannah River to the right, steamship on the river there on the far right, and the gas tanks standing at the eastern boundary of the city there.
There was a built there?
Yes, there was a little hill there. I mean, you have to think about, there were higher places along the river, and these were strategic locations. The bluff of Savannah, of course, Oglethorpe identified that as a very strategic location. Tomochichi had identified it as one prior to that. The Irene Mound was on a higher piece of land, which was made even higher by, adding dirt over time to that. So these were strategic locations along the river. We were very happy to get for this show, I think, some of the most beautiful drawings done on the Savannah River during the Civil War. These are two little sketches made in gouache and ink on the Savannah River. These are on loan to us from the Library of Congress, and they were drawn by one of the Woad brothers, who were among the most prolific of the Civil War illustrators or sketch artists. Both brothers worked in Savannah. Alfred R. Woad and William Woad were both born in England and studied art there. Alfred wanted to be a marine painter, wound up coming to Boston and doing illustration there, and then got hired by one of the newspapers. I think it was the New York Illustrated News, to do illustrations like the ones I've been talking about. William Woad, his younger brother, actually trained as an architect in England. He was an assistant to Sir Joseph Paxton and worked on the design of the Crystal Palace, and then came to America, where he began working, I believe, for Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newsletter. Both brothers wound up working for Harper's Weekly in 1864, and both brothers worked in the Savannah area. And so the Library of Congress isn't really sure who did these drawings. They credit them to Alfred Woad, but then there's a little caveat: these might be by William Woad. And William Woad's name appears in the newspaper, in Harper's, attached to these sketches. So there's still some question there, but regardless, they're really gorgeous little drawings showing an event that took place in 1864, not that long before Sherman's forces entered Savannah. What we're looking at is a fleet of flag of truce boats going down Savannah River to undertake an exchange of prisoners that happened in late November and early December of 1864. And they're really, like I said, they're beautifully drawn. I love the billowing smoke in this image. The artist has made notations, the names of the vessels there, and other notations at the bottom. And you'll see some little landmarks if you look very carefully. I believe Fort Pulaski is right here in the distance. You can see the little flagpole right there. And the city of Savannah appears in the background, apparently, in this image. So take a look at those closely if you get a chance to go up to the gallery tonight. And the Woads were, again, charged with really trying to put people on the spot and help communicate the scene in front of them. There were the article in Harper's that accompanied these, and by the way, let me show you how that drawing translated. So there's the sketch above, and that's how that would have translated into a wood engraving in Harper's. And the accompanying article had some interesting things to say in regard to this exchange of prisoners. The Times correspondent, they're talking about the New York Times, says, "The particularly striking feature of the scene to my eye was the grotesque appearance of the rebel steamers, especially the Swan and the General Lee." Both of those are in this image here. "Both vessels are great slab-sided, flat-bottom affairs, like unsightly houses washed from their foundations, having 3 rudders to guide them on account of their lightness of draught. A spectator at a distance, without being blessed with a lively imagination, might have supposed these queer specimens of naval architecture to be floating hearses, the illusion being fostered by the funeral-like plumes of Cimmerian smoke which waved from their slender chimneys." So the written piece embellishes the artistic image that we're looking at here. William Woad would also be here in Savannah to depict Sherman reviewing his troops on Bay Street. And there are a couple of really wonderful images. There's another engraving that's out there, and you can look that up, showing Sherman's troops marching down Bay Street. This is a drawing that was likely done, this one we're looking at here was likely done on the spot, also from the Library of Congress's collection, with Sherman there on the left reviewing his troops. I was talking about photographers earlier, and one that I wanted to mention in particular, because you'll see his work in the exhibition upstairs, is George N. Barnard, who is a photographer who he worked at one point with Matthew Brady. Many of you may have heard of him as one of probably the most prominent photographers of the Civil War. George Barnard followed Sherman's troops to Savannah. There's a portrait of Sherman with his officers outside of Atlanta that Barnard took. But you don't see battlefield scenes so much. And have you ever noticed how you don't see, the Civil War scenes you see are usually decimated cities or dead bodies lying around. Timothy H. O'Sullivan, whose work we saw earlier, was noted for these sort of gruesome battlefield scenes. Barnard, though, and you have to keep in mind that these photographers weren't working with the kind of cameras we have today. They had bulky equipment. They had to travel basically with a wagon load of darkroom equipment. The cameras could not capture the sort of action that we expect today. I mean, it would have been a blur. So what Barnard did, he wanted to kind of commemorate Sherman's march to the sea. And so he came back and followed Sherman's path after the war, photographing various locations. And these range from bombed-out cityscapes. On the left, you see an image of the city of Atlanta here with the ruined wall there. And on the right, you see, of course, the Forsyth Park Fountain here in Savannah. The Savannah images are quite a contrast to many of the others that you see in this volume. And this was a volume that Barnard published in 1866 as photographic views of the Sherman campaign. So in Savannah, you have all these scenic images. You have the Forsyth Park Fountain. You have Bonaventure Cemetery. And, of course, you have the river. And Barnard took 3 images of the river, which wound up in this folio. This one shows the Savannah River near Savannah. He doesn't mention a specific location, but this could have easily been taken from the riverbank of one of the Savannah River plantations. And if he was following Sherman's course, he may have been even wandered through Mulberry Grove, which had been burned, or perhaps another location. This could have been the Irene Mound site. The Irene Mound later was the site of Ray's Hall plantation. So I'm not sure exactly where this image was taken, but it was a little wilder stretch of river, probably just west of the city. And here we have one of 2 views that Barnard took from the steeple of the Old City Exchange, in this case looking upriver. And we're looking at a fairly sedate waterfront. I mean, not long after the Civil War. There are carts here with bales of cotton there. It looks like business is starting to get back to normal. Of course, Savannah shipped massive amounts of cotton out prior to the Civil War, and of course, those activities were all interrupted by the war. You had federal blockade ships out there after the fall of Fort Pulaski. So after the war, things did perk up a bit. We'll look at that in just a moment. There's another view by Barnard, this time looking downriver toward the ocean. And you can see all the masted vessels there lined up along the riverfront. And then not long after, 1872, we see a bustling riverfront that seems to be in the process of recovery, a port that seems to be in the process of recovery. This is a drawing. The upper image is a drawing. On the bottom is a wood engraving, both by the artist Harry Fenn, another British-born artist who studied engraving in England and came to the U.S. and became a very, very popular illustrator, illustrating numerous volumes of picturesque views. He did one published in 1872 by Appleton and Company called Picturesque America. He would later go on and do one of Picturesque Europe and Picturesque Palestine. But one of the images in Picturesque America was a view of Savannah from the river. And below you see the engraving as it would have appeared in that book. And these were these sort of nice coffee table-like books of picturesque views. The upper image is the pencil drawing for that engraving. So we were really excited to find that for the exhibition. So you can see that image upstairs. And on the skyline there, you see the Old City Exchange. That's not exactly how it looked. The artist took a few liberties here. But this is relatively close to the appearance of the Savannah waterfront at that time. You see various types of vessels and barges in the foreground. And of course, Savannah's port was greatly expanding during the late 19th century. We were home to perhaps one of the largest rosin yards in the world at that time. Here we're looking at naval stores or barrels of rosin on the wharf in Savannah from the 1880s. This was taken by the photographer William E. Wilson. Wilson was a fantastic documentary photographer who came from England to the U.S. as a child with his parents. His father was also a photographer, and you can see both of images of Savannah by both of these artists. If you Google them, look them up further. This is one from the Georgia Historical Society's collection. We really wanted to get this for the show, but it was not in good enough condition to exhibit. These are actually very, very small photographs too, by the way, but I think this is a really amazing view showing just the sheer scale of the rosin yards there. You see the ships lined up there to take on the rosin, and then the dock workers in the foreground, black and white. It's just a really wonderful snapshot of the times. Yep.
Would this be Irish workers, Irish?
I don't know. I mean, Irish laborers were employed a lot in Savannah. I mean, they worked on the Savannah Geechee Canal. I don't know if I could speak to this particular image in the wharf. Maybe someone with a deeper historical background could tell us, but I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head. This view here, this is in the exhibition upstairs. This is a slightly later view from around the turn of the century, and it's showing lumber at the wharves. We see a lot of images of lumber, lumber at the ports of Savannah. Lumber was a major Georgia product, along with rosin, which of course used for turpentine and naval stores. But here we see just massive piles of lumber in the foreground at the port. This was taken prior to 1905. We know that because the old City Exchange is still there on the skyline. It had not yet been replaced by City Hall. Another development that took place in the late 19th century, we're moving into the era of the great steamships and the founding of the Ocean Steamship Company in 1872 brought a lot of new commerce to the area. You had both freight and passengers who took advantage of the Savannah line of the Ocean Steamship Company and the many ships that were constructed and sailed forth from the port at that time. This is a great image from the Detroit Publishing Company. Again, many of these images, again, were later used as postcards. This is a great one. I love this image showing one of these huge steamships going down the river, heading back out to sea, taken from Bay Street, looking down one of the ramps. And there are piles of lumber again, you can see on the docks here. And I didn't include too many things that stray too far from the actual Savannah waterfront in this exhibition, but I couldn't help but include at least one of these images from the late 19th century in our collection. These really don't get out often enough. We have 4 or 5 beautiful little oil paintings done in the early 1890s by an artist named Ludmilla Pilat Welch, who was an artist mostly associated with the California art colonies. Spent most of her time in Marin County with her husband Thaddeus Welch, a German emigre artist. But Ludmilla Welch had some connections in Savannah. Her father was an Austrian emigre, had been in Savannah, and she had some family connections here. And she came through Savannah in the early 1890s and did a series of remarkably fresh little oil paintings on Tybee Island and between Savannah and Tybee. This is a great view from the north end of Tybee from 1890, showing the entrance to the Savannah River. And you can see a steamship there on the horizon heading into the river. We have a similar view showing palmettos and a sailing ship on the horizon by the same artist. This was probably the better of the 2 paintings, and so that's the one that you'll see in the exhibition upstairs. By the early 20th century, artists who were really just interested in art and not, reporting for a newspaper or, taking photographs for postcards. You have artists really going out there and looking for subject matter and discovering Savannah. And part of this came from the development of northern art colonies. The one of the early northern art colonies that really was sort of a breeding ground for American Impressionist painters, if you will, was the Old Lyme, Connecticut art colony. And one of the artists associated with that colony was Harry Leslie Hoffman, who moved in there to the house, excuse me, a house run by Florence Griswold, which is now a museum, and became part of that Old Lyme, Connecticut colony, where a lot of the American Impressionists congregated. In 1914 and 1915, Harry Hoffman came to Savannah, spent a couple of winters here visiting and making numerous paintings of the city's architecture, the Old City Market, and this is one of the few images I've seen of the Savannah River that Hoffman painted. This one is in the collection of the Morris Museum of Art in Augusta and is painted from one of the wharves. This is a small study. He's best known for larger oil paintings. He later traveled to the Bahamas and other more exotic locations, painting in a very colorful palette. This one's a very industrial view, though, and Hoffman must have brought word of Savannah back to Old Lyme because other Old Lyme painters also worked in Savannah. One of them was William Chadwick. I don't have an image of one of his works. In fact, I haven't seen one painted on the river. But Chadwick also spent time in Savannah earlier on and then came back and taught for the Savannah Art Club in the 1920s. Speaking of that, I think one of my favorite artists to have ever worked on the Savannah waterfront is this guy, Elliott Candy Clark. Clark did a remarkable series of oil paintings of the river in 1924 and 1925 when he was here as an artist of residence teaching for the Savannah Art Club, which operated out of the Telfair Academy across the street. The Savannah Art Club was founded in the late 19-teens by a group of local artists who were trying to further the cause of art in Savannah and exchange ideas, learn new techniques, and so on. In 1920, they were allowed to use space at the Telfair Academy to meet and to have art classes, and they began a program of artist residencies, and they would bring in artists from the Northeast, prominent artists from the Northeast, to teach classes during the winter months. And in 1924, the president of the art club wrote to the Art Students League in New York and was looking for an instructor to come down for that year's session. And Elliott Clark accepted that and came down and took his class out on field trips painting outdoors, and while he was here did some absolutely amazing paintings of the Savannah River. Clark was the son of a tonalist painter, Walter Clark, who was interested in sort of subtle shifts in value and color. Elliott Clark was more of an American Impressionist. He kept some of his father's tonalism, but he was influenced more by American Impressionism. He was a fan of tonalist painters like James Whistler. He had seen a show of Whistler's work in London, and Whistler, of course, is known for his nocturnes, and that may be one reason that Clark named this work Savannah Nocturne after Whistler. Clark was really drawn to the waterfront at dusk, at twilight. He said that was his favorite time. He said that there was a certain silvery kind of light that he could see on the river at dusk that he found truly magical. And he explored this subject matter, again, in a series of works. Here we see Savannah Nocturne from Telfair's collection, and we're looking down one of the ramps toward the river. Various vessels docked in the port. There's still people milling about, but you get the sense that the day's work is about done. There is activity going on across the river. You see lights across the river and smoke across the river at the wharves and industry over there. Here's another view of River Street looking west toward the Savannah Electric Company's power plant on the west end of River Street, with the warehouses on the left. On the right, you'll see workers, again, who look like they're wrapping things up for the day. We have a horse-drawn cart on the right. There's a train car moving down the tracks. This piece reminds me so much of Monet's paintings of the train stations, that kind of industrial view with billowing clouds of smoke. Clark certainly must have known of these works, which were painted decades earlier. And Clark did some other great Savannah paintings here, a couple I'll show you in other collections. On the left is an image of Savannah from 1924, also from the Morris Museum of Art, looking looking downriver toward the ocean. And on the right, an image of River Street from the Johnson collection, which is the source of the Romantic Spirits exhibition that you'll see across the street at the Telfair Academy right now. The 1920s were a very active time on the Savannah waterfront for artists. There was really sort of boom and interest. I think a lot of it had to do with artists like Elliott Clark coming to Savannah, and young artists like Christopher Murphy Jr., who were part of the Savannah Art Club and were going out on these sketching expeditions with visiting artists. Around that time, the 1920s, you really see a proliferation of images. People really started to appreciate, local artists, I think, really started to appreciate the physical environs of Savannah and wanted to record that in art. On the left, we see a work, one of a group of etchings in our collection by Elizabeth O'Neill Verner, who was a Charleston artist. She's sort of the Christopher Murphy of Charleston, I guess you could call her. She was very interested in preservation, set up an etching studio in Charleston, and is one of that city's beloved artists today, associated with the Charleston Renaissance. She came to Savannah in the late 20s and did a series of etchings. I think this is one of the strongest of that group, showing the old harbor light and the ramp there at East Broad with a cart heading up the ramp, and a woman, a vendor, carrying a basket on her head. On the right is an image by Christopher Murphy that's undated, could well be from the 1920s, showing a group of folks looking down the staircase leading underneath the old cotton exchange. Chris Murphy, as I mentioned earlier, was one of these artists who really seemed to be on a mission to capture and record as much of Savannah's environment as possible. And he spent a lot of time on the riverfront. There are just so many images that Chris Murphy drew or painted on the riverfront. This one shows a large vessel at the port. It's called Antioch Docking from about 1925. It's a great image, I think, for a number of reasons. It's a beautiful little painting, for one thing, but you're looking at several different kinds of vessels here. You're looking at a contrast of old and new, perhaps. In the foreground, we have these men rowing bateaux, these little flat-bottomed skiffs that you would have seen very frequently in those days. Often men made these boats themselves. I interviewed an artist many years ago who grew up on Williamson Street right next to the river. And as a child, he'd go down to the river and he would see men making these boats. So you have those in the foreground there. In the background, you have a sailing vessel. You can see the mast of the sailing vessel behind the wharf. And the foreground coming in, docking here, is a large steamship looking like it's getting ready to take on freight. So it may be a contrast of old and new there, the sailing ship in the background, the big freighter in the foreground. A couple of other views by Chris Murphy of the river from our collection. These, I'm sorry to say, did not make it into the show for reasons of space. On the left, two more steamships coming into the port. On the right, a view of Lazaretto Creek and Cockspur Island Light. Here's a wonderful little etching by Chris Murphy Jr. Showing, again, a variety of vessels at the Port of Savannah. In this case, we finally get a look at some major cotton being loaded or unloaded. This is a riverboat here bearing the name Augusta, so it might be just involved in river traffic, whereas in the background here, we have another one of those ocean-going steamships. And then, of course, many bales of cotton that look like they're being loaded on or perhaps loaded off the riverboat that you see here. And cotton, I should point out, by that time, we think of cotton as this incredible, export of Georgia, something that, of course, was a major part of the economy of this state in the 19th century and that continues on today. But at the time that this drawing or this etching was made in the 1920s, of course, cotton had taken a huge hit from the boll weevil in 1918. And so you really did not, it was sort of a decline in that industry at the time. Of course, now we're back up to historic levels thanks to the control of the boll weevil and improved agricultural technology. Moving into the 1930s, I get to talk briefly about one of my very favorite artists to work on the river, William O. Golding, who has just an incredibly fascinating story, and he's one of the few self-taught artists who's included in the exhibition. William Golding was an African-American sailor who spent many of his last days at the old Marine Hospital in Savannah here, which you see, which is now a building operated by SCAD. And Golding was tricked aboard a vessel as a child in the 1880s. A captain and his wife were standing on the deck of a ship, and I think the captain's wife wanted a cabin boy, basically. And the captain asked his wife to pick out one of these two boys, and Golding said they were looking at him and his cousin. They were standing there on the wharf, and they picked him and asked him if he would like to come aboard and see the ship. So he came aboard the ship and he went down below. They took him on a tour, and when he came back up on deck, he found out that he was already out at sea. He said he saw a big wheel and a man standing behind the wheel, and he saw a light blinking in the distance, and he asked the man what the light was, and he said that was the Tybee light. And he didn't see Savannah again until after the turn of the 20th century. And in all that time, he apparently served on a variety of different sailing vessels. He traveled the world. He went around Cape of Good Hope, and I don't know how many times he says in his letters. He chronicled all of these experiences and in a series of drawings that he made in the 1930s when he was recuperating at the Marine Hospital. And there was an artist there who was working as a volunteer, a member of the Savannah Art Club, who encouraged Golding. And Golding had been telling these stories. His nickname was Deep Sea. And he would tell stories about his exploits. And he was encouraged to draw these. He did these just amazing little drawings showing sailing vessels, various exotic ports of call, and on occasion he would show the Savannah waterfront. And this is an image from the Telfair's collection showing the tug William F. Macaulay cruising down the Savannah River. And you'll notice that he includes a lot of wonderful little details, various buildings and businesses that you would have seen in downtown Savannah. Not all of these would have been on the waterfront. Some of these were on Broughton Street, but he moves them down to the waterfront for the drawing, like the Savannah Morning News building here, or the Germania Bank here. So some of these landmarks were sort of compressed and put down there on the waterfront. Another really interesting thing, I think, is that he includes not the City Hall, which was there at that time, but the Old City Exchange, which he would have been familiar with as a child. That would have been standing there when he was kidnapped from the port of Savannah. So it's just, again, there's just such personality in these little drawings. I just love these things. He usually includes a little nameplate there. Sometimes there are little screw heads drawn on the nameplate. And he'll include little details about the tug belongs to the Atlantic Towing Company. This piece is from 1934. Here are a couple of other Goldings. On the left, a piece from the collection, from the Smithsonian's collection called the USS Tybee. Again, there are only a handful of these images that Golding drew that actually show the Savannah waterfront. I've only seen about maybe literally like 5 of those images. On the right, we have another image that's in the show upstairs. It's the steam yacht Norma Hall, which was the yacht that belonged to John Jacob Astor, who famously went down on the Titanic. This is the Norma Hall, to my knowledge, never entered the Savannah River. It did come close to us. It apparently made stops on Jekyll Island, and I think a great little detail is this little boat in the foreground, which bears the letters WTOC. This was drawn in 1933, and WTOC was Savannah's first radio station. It went on the air in 1929. So he's included a little piece of Savannah in that image.
What happened to the cousin?
I don't know what happened to his cousin. He disappears from the story. In fact, most of what we know about Golding comes from a pair of letters that he wrote to Margaret Stiles, who was the artist and volunteer who worked at the Marine Hospital and encouraged him to draw. And she would sell his drawings for him. A big group of his drawings wound up in a New York penthouse and turned up in Town and Country magazine at one point. There were other little groupings of his work out there. We're very fortunate to have 4 of his pieces in the Telfair's collection. There are many more of them at the Morris Museum in Augusta.
How old was he when he was kidnapped?
He was, I'm trying to think, I think it was 10 or 12 years old when he was kidnapped.
When was that?
1882, I believe. And again, he was in the Marine Hospital in the 1930s and 40s. He died in the early 40s. Moving back to professionally trained artists working on the river, this is Elliot O'Hara. O'Hara was a very prominent watercolorist. In fact, he published numerous books, how-to books, on how to paint in watercolor. He came to Savannah in 1934 and 1935 and taught classes at Telfair. And this is an image of a Savannah dock fire. And as we know, there have been fires that happen at the port from time to time. There's a great image William Wilson took in the 1880s of a huge fire at the rosin yards at the port. This image from 1930, I think it's from 1935. It says circa 34 in our files, but I think it's probably closer to 35 because there are images you can see online at the Georgia Historical Society that show a massive fire that broke out in one of the central, the railroad sheds there at the dock. I think it was a warehouse holding fertilizer that went up in flames, and there were these billowing clouds of white smoke that looked awfully like this watercolor painting. So my suspicion is this was painted in 1935, which was one of the 2 years that O'Hara was in Savannah. An artist, these are not nautical images or views of the river, but I wanted to mention this artist briefly because he was, I think, a key figure in establishing what would become a waterfront art colony or art community. This is Henry Lee McPhee, who was an artist associated with the Woodstock Art Colony. He was one of many artists associated with Woodstock who came down to Savannah and worked in Savannah and on the waterfront in the 1930s and 40s. McPhee came here, he was mainly a still life painter, he's best known for his still life paintings, and he set up an art school in 1939 on the Savannah riverfront. And the art school was short-lived, but he taught some prominent Savannah artists like Augusta Olschig in the short time that he was here. She wound up taking over his studio and starting her own art school after he left. And then Augusta talked to me about this experience, and she said that she later gave up the same studio for this guy, Alexander Brooke, who was a very, very popular and a well-known artist working in America in the 1930s, in 1940s in particular. He was based in New York. He was the director of the Whitney Studio School at one time, which later became the Whitney Museum of American Art. He was a very prominent painter, had commissions from famous people, portrait commissions from famous people. He painted painted movie stars like Katharine Hepburn. He painted a portrait of the daughter of actor Frederick March. So he's a very, very prominent guy. And in around 1937, 1938, he comes to Savannah, and he paints an image in Tin City, which was a shanty town that existed to the east of downtown Savannah, just to the east of downtown Savannah, where people made buildings, made homes out of scrap tin and whatever they could find, basically. And he painted this picture, which he called Georgia Jungle, which went on to win the Carnegie International Prize in 1939, and he got a lot of attention for that. So he was a famous artist when he returned to Savannah in 1941, and there were all kinds of articles about him. This is a little clipping from Life magazine. He was covered very frequently in the Savannah Morning News, and he's shown here working in his studio on Factor's Walk. So Brooke worked here between around 1938 and 1948 on the river. There you see him there at his easel. Here you see him again at his easel, this time outdoors on Factor's Walk, right outside of his studio building. And Brooke became this sort of galvanizing force for the Savannah art community. He inspired a lot of local artists. He encouraged his friends from the north to come down and visit Savannah. There's an image of Brooke painting from the balcony of his riverfront studio. On the left is an image. Unfortunately, we don't have a major river scene by Brooke in our collection. This one is called Savannah Sky, and it shows sort of the industrial skyline along the river, and that's in the exhibition upstairs. But like I said, Brooke's doings were covered frequently in the Savannah Morning News, and before long, newspaper articles started referring to Brooke and the other artist who had settled into Riverfront Studios as an art colony. And the paper talks about all these activities that are going on in these waterfront studios. This is an artist who worked on the waterfront around that same time, 1941, Mark Sheridan, who was an architect and interior designer. This piece won an award at the Telfair that same year, 1941, and was purchased for our collection. And it's a very serene view of River Street and far less impressionistic than the one we saw earlier, a couple of decades earlier, by Elliott Clark. But this serenity was short-lived, of course, because we have World War II taking place, and other artists are visiting during the war years, some of them at Brooks' encouragement, like these two, Andre Ruellen on the left and her husband, John Taylor. And the two of them do some amazing paintings in Savannah. This is Ruellen's The Wind-Up, which is in the collection of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. This is River Landscape by John Taylor from our collection. This is Ruellen's, I think, one of her best paintings of Savannah, which is in our collection and is in the show upstairs, painted in 1942. Now, 1942 was sort of a key period on the waterfront. A lot of things were happening at that time. Obviously, there was a very heightened interest in homeland security. So in April of 1942, there were restrictions placed on access to the waterfront. Unless you lived there or had business there and could show proof that you were supposed to be there, you were not allowed on the waterfront. And photography along the waterfront was not permitted during the war years from 1942 to 1945. You have to remember Liberty ships were being built just downriver, just east of the city. And so Ruellen, there's a story in which Ruellen and her husband are sketching near the Savannah waterfront from their car. And they have their sketchbooks put inside some newspaper, which is a technique they had learned from another artist at the Woodstock colony. And they were picked up by the police, suspected of being spies, and hauled in and questioned, and they eventually had to call Alexander Brooke, who came down and said, it's okay, they're just artists, they're not spies. But that was the kind of atmosphere of the times. And so we don't see a lot of images of the waterfront from that period. There are a few others. Here are some other images by Ruellen. The one on the left from the Morris Museum, the one on the right, a drawing from our collection. Here, an image by Christopher Murphy, also from the war years. Really interesting image showing a British ship going upriver here, an American vessel, possibly a Coast Guard vessel on the right, and this American flag, little patriotic gesture, flying from one of the flagpoles on the balcony overlooking the river. There are a lot of civilians there, and that makes one think, makes one wonder when this was done. It had to have been done in early 1942 before the restrictions took place, or it may have been done at the close of the war. It came to us undated, so we're not certain. After the war, Brooke returned to Savannah with his third wife, Gina Nee, shown here, who was a painter. And the two of them, again, set up shop in one of the River Street studios. And they were well known as an artist couple here. Again, a lot of activity, that took place at the waterfront, especially artists, social activities sort of happened in the orbit of the Brookes. While in Savannah in this later period, Brooke painted a Saturday Evening Post cover, a portrait of a little girl from Savannah named Barbara Ann Sharp. His wife, Brooke's wife, Gina Nee, also painted in Savannah, won awards for her paintings. And the two of them left Savannah in 1948 and moved back north. He kept the place in Sag Harbor for a good bit of his career. This is a really fun image. I'm just showing you this because it's funny. This is Brooke tooling around the Hamptons in his secondhand Rolls Royce. And this is Jackson Pollock in the car with him there. Brooke was a really interesting guy, just really gregarious, just kind of sort of the life of the party. His paintings were really kind of depressing and very gray and drab, but apparently he was a very lively guy, and there was always a lot of social activity surrounding him. I'm going to skip ahead because we're running low on time. This is an art studio founded in the late 1940s by Savannah artist Augusta Olschig. She would leave Savannah not long after this, but she came back in 1960, and she kept a studio on River Street until the early 1980s when she had to move out. There were some artists of a little more modern persuasion who were working along the river in the 1940s and 50s. Going into the 1950s, Emil Holzhauer, who taught at Wesleyan College in Macon, with Robert Henry, and his own work was a little more modernist in flavor. This is an image of the Savannah-Ogeechee Canal, not far from the Savannah River and the Central of Georgia Railroad bridges over the canal. And on the right, we have Factor's Walk by Lamar Dodd, who was the key figure and founder of the art department at the University of Georgia in Athens. From the 1950s here, Anna Hunter's view of the riverfront from seaboard docks. Anna Hunter was an amazing person. She was a self-taught artist. She served her country overseas in World War II. She was a widow at that point with kids. She served overseas in World War II, came back, wrote art reviews in the society column for the Savannah Morning News, and she was one of the women who founded the Historic Savannah Foundation. So just a really interesting person. She was part of Alexander Brooks' coterie of artists in the late 1940s on the riverfront, and she took a children's art class from Augusta Olshig, remember the slide I showed you earlier, and took up painting on her own. And her own work is sort of naive. She's really basically kind of a folk artist. But some charming images like the one that you see here of the Savannah waterfront from the Seaboard Airline docks. We're going to skip ahead a little bit to the next decade, the 1960s. The art colony and the art studios and the Factor's Walk building continued on through this time. And one of the more prominent artists who arrived in the 1960s was Bill Scharf, William Scharf, who was a figure associated with abstract expressionism. He paints these gorgeous, lyrical, poetic abstract paintings with often with these very luminous forms. Scharf arrived in the 60s. He was married to Sally Kravitch of Savannah and visited Savannah frequently, and eventually wound up doing more work in Savannah than he did in his studio in New York. And there you see him in his Factor's Walk studio. He kept that studio until the 1980s. And although his work is abstract, this is a large work in our permanent collection called Ascending Betrayal. But in the show upstairs, you'll see one of his studies for that work. And what's, I think, really cool is that he spent a lot of time looking out of his studio window, and he would record on his sketches the names of vessels coming into and leaving the port. So there's one of those you can see upstairs in the show, and I think this shape here actually reminds you of the hull of one of those big vessels coming down the Savannah River. Now, of course, by the 1970s, River Street was not looking so hot. These are a couple of images that my father took in the 1970s, looking at River Street that looks like it's just come through a war or something. Old buildings on the river had been demolished or had fallen in on themselves. We're looking just to the west of City Hall here, the site of where the Hyatt would be built later on. This is a view, of course, of the Talmadge Bridge, which was built across the river in 1953. Just amazing when we think of the river today, that really not that long back, this is what was going on there. Here's a train going down River Street, also in the early 1970s. Of course, big changes happened in the 1970s. You have the plan to revitalize River Street adopted by the city. Eric Meyerhoff and Bob Gunn drafted a plan to replace these decaying wharves and the dirt bluff there with a nice bricked promenade, and that turned out to be an incredibly important decision because it fueled this massive boom in tourism that we still benefit from today. There were artists around during those days in the 1970s. One I wanted to mention briefly tonight, Ann Osteen, who bought an old cotton warehouse in 1971 and still works there today. And she's an amazing painter, and her work blends realism and abstraction, like this work here, Hide and Seek on River Street, on the left, and on the right, an image of a ship, but it's one that's cropped very carefully so that you might not recognize what it is at first glance. But Ann is a terrific painter, and I'm just so happy that she's still there and still working in a riverfront studio, because most of these studios are now gone. Ann's I guess in her 80s now. This is a work by Myrtle Jones, another beloved Savannah artist, and I'm showing you this because this is, of course, a view of River Street after the renovations of the 1970s. Here we're looking at a view looking west toward the Hyatt, which was built or completed in 1981, and of course was a big source of controversy because it built over the river, and is one of the most prominent things that you see on the River Street, the streetscape today. It's a really, I'm more of a fan of Myrtle's early paintings, but I really like this one. She does some really nice things there in that composition, flattening out forms, and I like the way that some of the outfits here and the shoes rhyme with the flags that you see here. We don't have a date on this painting, but obviously it was painted after 1981. Other artists working on the river in the 1980s included Betsy Kane, who's a really fantastic abstract painter. She was there the same time that William Scharf was. Although I don't have a view of the interior of her River Street studio, it looked a lot like this, and this pair of wings are part of a sculpture that Betsy exhibited on River Street in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, you also see this increased use of the river for arts events. There was an event called the Savannah Arts Festival, which eventually became the Arts on the River Festival. And the Savannah Arts Festival took place in different locations, at the Central of Georgia Railroad Sheds, where my father exhibited his photographs in the 1970s. It moved to Forsyth Park at one point, and then was at the river, where I exhibited in the 1980s. So I've kind of seen all these things happen, these transitions happen. But what I think is really interesting, what's been interesting to see is the way that the river sort of blossomed as this place of not just artist studios, but a place where artists showed their work. And you have galleries like Gallery 209 that are still there on River Street today, and many artists who work on the river today. This is an image of the Arts on the River Festival. It's one of a group of teens from Telfair's after-school art clubs who were exhibiting their work at the Arts on the River Festival in the 1990s. The river is also, of course, today a great place to see public art in Savannah. It's become some of our key public monuments are located along River Street today. One of the earliest being the Waving Girl Monument, installed in 1971, designed by Felix de Weldon, best known for the Iwo Jima Memorial, the African American Monument from 2002, and of course the most recent, the World War II Monument. The concept artist was Eric Meyerhoff, who again was responsible in part for the transformation of River Street that we see today. Of course, I can't talk about the river without mentioning Jack Lee. There's a fantastic exhibition that was just up at the SCAD Museum, and you'll see this exhibition in this work in our exhibition upstairs, Moored Ship and Silos from 1986, which was featured on the cover of Jack's book, Seaport, A Waterfront at Work, which was published in 1996, which shows a commercial vessel docked here in front of the Kaolin Wharf. And to close the night, I'm sorry, this is not a contemporary image. You'll notice that the last images in this show are really from about the 1980s, and the real reason for that is that that's sort of where these works end in our collection, in terms of works available in our collection. But this is a great image by artist Wes Fraser, who had a solo show here a few years ago. West is best known as a plein air painter, working in oil outdoors. But this is one of his earlier pieces. He did these really large-scale, meticulous watercolors. And this is a great view looking at the Savannah River. The Talmadge Bridge is still here in this image. It hasn't been replaced by the new suspension bridge yet. But you do have one of the big container vessels over here that are probably one of the things we associate most with river traffic today. And those container ships, they first started to appear in the mid-1960s, about 1965. And of course, they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you stand on Broughton Street today, you'll see what looks like, a building moving past on the horizon, but it's actually a container ship. Anyway, I think a good image to end the exhibition and this talk with, because it does at least give one a flavor of what our riverfront is like today, with both the restored riverfront and the port and port activities that keep Savannah a vital city and keep us going. There are a lot of other great artists that I didn't get to mention tonight, but please check out their work. There are artists like Robert Morris and Charlie Ellis, who've recently done work on the Savannah River. There's a great photographer named Zig Jackson who teaches at SCAD, who has done a really amazing image, sort of looking back to actually almost reclaiming the Savannah River, kind of going back to the Native American history of Savannah. So I encourage you to check out all of those artists. There are great resources online if you want to look at more of these images. The Library of Congress, the Georgia Historical Society, Armstrong. Go and dig and find out more about the Savannah River and about the artists who have explored it over time. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And please go upstairs and check out the exhibition.